Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my trek from Budapest to Istanbul. I'm excited to be here today. I don't know if any of you recall that I was here 2 years ago and I talked about my trek to Machu Picchu and my hike on the Inca Trail. Okay, this is nothing like that. I did not walk for 4 days and 3 nights. I did not hike in the wilderness. I did not go without electricity, and I did shower on this trip and blow dry my hair. So, however, this was a challenging trip in different ways, visiting far off remote places and meeting some really interesting people. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So my college buddy, with whom I hiked the Inca Trail, asked me if we should tackle Eastern Europe. And we had gone to Budapest in our college days, which is in the 1980s, but actually before Hungary got their independence from the communists. So it was a really, really different time period. And so I said that I was ready to take on the challenge again. So my immediate challenge is to try and get this presentation to you in 45 minutes to an hour. So bear with me because I have a lot of information, and I think you'll find it really interesting. But before I move on from this page, I wanted to show you a quick picture. This is actually an original Saxon gate that was put up in the 1500s in the town of Braslo, which is in southern Romania. And it's called the Catherine's Gate. And I wanted to know if anybody can tell me the significance of the towers. This is probably the only quiz I'm going to give you. So, as you can see, there's one main tower in the middle, and I forgot my pointer, honey. And there's surrounded by 4 side towers. And what that meant in the Middle Ages is when you approached a town like this and you saw these 5 towers, it meant that the town recognized capital punishment. So if you entered those gates, you better be a good boy and girl, or there will be real consequences, fatal consequences. Okay, next. So I followed the Blue Danube River to start, and then I made some adaptations. I actually did all the planning and preparation for this trip, which is a huge undertaking because in the old days, like the 80s, you couldn't go on a trip like this, just doing it all online. But I did tackle that challenge. I booked all my hotels on Booking.com and Amazon.com, did a lot of research with TripAdvisor, actually met people across the country who had done something similar. I met a very nice woman from Denver, Colorado, who was in her 60s and used to go on 90 to 120-day voyages with her husband, retired teacher. That was the life. Anyway, so she gave me some tips as well. We did 17 days, and because that's a long time and my memory's not so great, I decided to do a travel blog. As you can see over on the right, the Wendel travel blog. And at night, we had Wi-Fi wherever we went. And I would go in there and I would sort of just put in all my findings for the day, which really helped me put this presentation together. But then you always have the planning versus the reality. So, of course, idealistically, I planned my trip. And then things happen like 2 days before we left, the U.S. government put a restriction on Americans going to Hungary. Why? We had something called the Syrian migration. And so then all of a sudden, it was actually the U.S. State Department and my girlfriend and I like, oops, we're going anyway. Then the day before we left, the country of Hungary closed their border with Serbia in the south because of Syrian migration. So what was happening is they were coming from Syria up through, I don't know if any of you recall this, in mid-September, up through Greece, and they were actually entering Budapest as an entree to the common market, because Budapest is part of the common market, and they were getting as far as the Budapest train station. So there were basically tens of thousands of migrants stuck at the Budapest train station. And where were we heading? Budapest. So this required some adaptation, which I will tell you in the next slide. But in summary, we traveled 10,500 air miles. I walked or covered on land about 1,800 miles. And my Fitbit told me that I walked 263,609 steps, or about 130 miles, And in one day, I actually did 100 flights of steps. Woo! That was a record. And you will see why, because we were climbing monasteries and steps, and I will show you that in a minute. So all in, we were talking about 12,527 miles. So a short trip. So let me show you my itinerary. So this was how we started out. We wanted to fly into Budapest, and then we were taking the overnight train, 11-hour overnight train to Sitzasora, which is in the heart of Transylvania. Then we were going on to Brasov and Bucharest, and from there we were heading into Bulgaria, Veliko Tarnovo. The only change to this itinerary, we made two main changes. One is we did not get to Sofia because I know, but it was a trade-off. What we wanted to do was visit this little town on the Bulgarian-Turkey border called Edirne, and we also wanted to do a day trip to Ephesus. So we had to give up Sofia, but we were able to see everything else along the way. And the only other thing that we did was, remember I told you about that little Syrian migration issue at Budapest train station? We were not taking the overnight out of Budapest. So I did a lot of research and found an airline called Wizz Airlines, yes. And it flew from Budapest to this little town called Targas-Mirju, which is right outside of Sitzasora, and then we just hired a taxi to take us there. So not only did we avoid an 11-hour overnight train ride, where apparently we heard later they abused anyone with a passport, whether you were American or not, but we actually got to skip all the Syrian immigrants that were living in the Budapest train station. So moving on to today. Next slide, sorry. Okay. So this is what's on tap today. I know it's aggressive, but hopefully you'll be a good crowd. We're going to cover churches, a couple in Budapest, a couple in Bulgaria. We're going to do fortified churches and castles in Transylvania. They're not the same as churches. And so I'm going to take you to Biertan-Saxon and Rupea, and then we're going to talk about Bran Castle and some legends that came out of there. Then we'll move to fortresses and monasteries in Romania and Bulgaria. And finally, as a surprise at the end, I'm going to do 2 mystery sites. You have to stay awake. Next. I'm going to do a brief overview because, to be honest, I could sit here the entire hour and talk to you about the history of these countries. But I think you want to learn about other stuff as well. So I'm going to keep this part brief. But essentially, what you had is in 950 AD, although it goes way back before that, there were 2 major forces that were, you do have a, great, thank you. There were 2 major forces that were really struggling for power and land, and those were the Magyars in the north, which are modern-day Hungarians, and the Ottomans in the south, which are the Turks. So these 2 forces throughout the years were constantly traveling towards each other, and what you had was Romania and Bulgaria in the middle, fighting to keep their territory and retaining their language and their culture. And what you're going to see over time and through all the places that I show you is how this has transpired. In this slide, you can see Bulgaria has, the Bulgars, has a lot of territory, the Bulgarian Empire. So, and then also, as part of the Magyars is where Romania is. So watch what happens. Turn the clock ahead 300 years. Sorry, 500 years. A mere 500 years. Okay, so I don't know if anyone of you can see this, but essentially the Ottoman Empire has basically taken over Bulgaria. So there is no more Bulgaria and most of Romania. And then Hungary has basically captured the territory toward the north. And this was actually before a lot of the Holy Crusades. So this is only 1490. What you also see is this little territory here called Wallachia. And that was a stronghold because at the time the Hungarians asked the Saxons from Germany to come in and help protect their lands against the Ottomans. And it was during this time that they built a lot of these fortified churches that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So keep this territory in mind as I go through the different places, because it will really help you understand the influences and controls that the people of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria actually were subjected to. Okay, first stop on our list is Budapest, as that's how they say it in Budapest. And I wanted to talk about St. Matthias' church because it actually has origins going back to the 9th century. Now, the church that you see in the picture has been rebuilt a number of times, but they actually did find literature and manuscripts going back to the 9th century. Somebody was talking to me, Dave was talking to me today about his church and how they kept minutes until the 1700s. I'm like, God, they got you beat. Going back to the 9th century. So the Hungarians actually, without getting into too much history, really fought off during their time period Ottomans, Germans, Austrians, and Soviets. And they only gained their independence in their true democracy in 1989, which is a very small time period. The city of Budapest is the unification of two separate cities with the Danube River in the middle. So you had Buda and you had Pest, and they've joined together now to be modern-day Budapest. And in terms of the church itself, one of the unique features is also called the Church of the Lady. It was built between the 13th and 15th centuries, and what's very unique about the church is actually the multicolored tiles on the roof, which my husband tells me are polychromatic. Okay, so turning to the next page. In this particular church, you have the main altar over there. If you put the pointer over there, thank you. That was created based on Gothic triptychs. And what a triptych is it's a work of art, usually like a panel painting, that's divided into 3 sections. And it was very popular during the Gothic period in Europe. And you see a lot of altarpieces in churches and cathedrals that use this type of treatment. The stained glass windows in the middle, they are from the 1800s. So basically this church began as a Christian church. The Ottomans came in and converted the church to a mosque in 1541. So what's interesting is when I talk about different sites, in some cases the Ottomans basically just destroyed them. In the cases of fortresses and a lot of monasteries, burnt them to the ground, destroyed everything. Interesting, in the churches, they tend to leave them alone and convert them. So they would convert them to a mosque. And so that happened actually in Hagia Sophia, which is probably very well known, and then it was converted back. So it's interesting that they didn't just destroy everything. They sort of had a respect for the religion, but the fortified churches or monasteries they tended to destroy. Anyway, some Franciscan friars renovated it in the Baroque style after the Ottomans left. However, it was burnt down in 1823 and restored in 1873. So you have a lot of different styles in this church, but it was a very interesting example of how the churches in Europe actually are destroyed and rebuilt, but they still keep a little bit from the previous time period. Okay, moving on to the next interesting church in Budapest. This is called St. Stephen's Basilica. And so this one was designed in the New Classical style using the Greek cross floor plan. So I don't know if there's any architects there, but that's a very classic style that was used a lot in Europe. And St. Stephen was the first Hungarian Christian king. So this church was dedicated in his name, and they began in 1851, which is quite late, when you'll see some of my other ruins that I talk about. But as they started constructing it, this beautiful dome, collapsed. So it took them about 50 years to rebuild it at that time. Now, the Hungarians are into mummified relics, and in this church, the mummified forearm of St. Stephen's is here in the Chapel of the Holy Right Hand. Now, all I want to say on that matter is I saw the box. It was a very pretty ornate box, but I never really saw the arm in there. So I can't say 100% that the arm was in there, but I'm going to believe them. However, I did see in another church a foot that was mummified, and there they had the foot. So I don't know what's going on with the arm. But anyway, the dome is 315 feet high, and it is visible throughout Budapest. So if you ever see a skyline picture of Budapest, you will very clearly see the domes of this church. And the 2 bell towers over on the right were destroyed during World War II. The Nazis destroyed them in 1944. So as a good gesture, the German Catholics very recently compensated them for the loss, and they rebuilt the church. So now it has bells again. Okay, so now we're getting into the next stop, which is Transylvania. All right, our first stop is this beautiful little town called Victory, and it's one of the best preserved Saxon villages in Romania. And again, I started to tell you a little bit about Wallachia. So this is in Wallachia. And in the 1400s, they reached out to the Saxons and asked them if they could please come in, settle in this area, and protect them from the Magyars to the north and the Turks to the south. So the Saxons actually came in to this area. There are little enclaves of people that speak German only. Their schools were in German. If you go visit the museums, all the writing is in German. It's almost like a little ghetto in the heart of Romania. And even though the people themselves spoke Slavic. They spoke Slavic, and they were mostly peasants and farmers. They actually got along really well with the Saxons. So the Saxons arrived in the 1400s, and they stayed until 1990. Yes. Some of them left at the eve of World War I and the eve of World War II because that was a little dicey. But the last of the Saxons only left in 1990. But I am told there's like 16 that still live in the town. But for the most part, they have gone back to Germany, which is interesting. Another interesting thing is this particular town ended up gaining their independence from the Russians. So they were really under non-Romanian rule until the Russians came in, which is odd. So what they typically did was they would go into an area and they would put a fortified wall all around, and then within that city they would have a church, and they would have a tower. They would have small bastions and dungeons for torturing. And so that would create a defensive position for them, and they'd be able to look out among the hills to see if there was any enemies coming. Another interesting thing about this small little town that no one knows anything about is that the Prince of Wales, Charles, has a guest house in Victory. So he's brought a lot of notoriety to the small little town. So, turning to the next page, here is the view. I climbed up to one of the towers, and that's the view looking out into the cute little Saxon village. But on my way up, I was greeted by these little wild turkeys. But before I even got there, it's just funny. You drive into this town, and it's just a dirt road. So you're going in, and it just like puffs of dirt all in front of you, and you turn the corner, and you head up to the church, and you're like, where am I? And as you pass these cute little houses over on the right there, you see these old Romanian ladies out there knitting socks. I'm like, does that really happen? And you see these little turkeys and animals and roosters running around. So you hear, a little clucking here and there, and you have these cute little Romanian children with their grubby little brown faces playing with all the chickens. And I thought, oh my God, this really does happen in this day and age. But it really did give you a nice feel for what this village was like 400 years ago. So here's just one more view of the whitewashed walls of the church. So after I passed the turkeys and I said hello, I walked up and I actually entered the church. And there was nobody there. They're like, oh yeah, come on in, just pay your... and this isn't obviously an old church. I know in America they'd be like, okay, don't touch this, don't touch that, you need to wear gloves. But they were like, come on in, just put your money at the door and walk around. So I did, and on the right side, they had this cute little chapel. That's actually me down there. And that was built in 1185 by the Hungarians, but then the Saxons took over the church, said, okay, it's ours now. So it's interesting that they had Franco-Conian dialects in German, and so they actually, in this particular area of Transylvania, all spoke German. So it was a bit of an oddity. It was interesting. Okay, next stop on our voyage is the town of Biertan, another Saxon village. Again, the same situation. Saxons came in, helped them protect it. In this particular case, this town was a larger in a circle, so fortified walls, a number of towers. There are actually 7 towers in total. What was interesting about this particular city is that it became the seat of the bishop, the Saxon bishop. So it actually, they came in and they preached Protestantism, and they actually, I read, force converted most of the peasants and farmers to Protestantism, even though the country itself was Catholic. So in this picture, you see 6 towers. So up on the right is the clock tower. And then over to the south, right in front, yep, that one is the Catholic tower. So if you didn't convert, you could actually pray in there. There's a little chapel. Over to the right was the Bacon Tower. That's where they had the food that they stored during sieges, because very often they were under attack and they had to make sure they could eat, so they stored the food in there, protected it. And over here in the back, that tower was, that tower, this tower was where that's the prison tower, so it had a torture chamber in the basement, but that's where they housed any men that wanted a divorce. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's where they kept the men that wanted divorces. It gets better. Okay, so as we enter the church, I had to climb these 140 steps, as if that wasn't enough. I got to the top, and there was stone when I got up there, and apparently I was told all the villains in the town had to stand on this stone for like days on end, so everyone in the town would know that they were bad. Yes. On the right side is another picture of the Catholic tower, and then down below was an interesting panoramic that I tried on my iPhone. Anyway, again, this was the seat of the Lutheran bishop for almost 300 years, so they were there a long time. So if you turn to the next page, you will see inside the church, which I thought was really cool, right there. It's done in the late Gothic and Renaissance style, the stone masonry, and most of it was rebuilt in the 15 to 1525 time period, which is when the bishop was there and that was his seat, so they put a lot of money to the church. They had, if you look at the altar, which is over on the right, that is the Viennese style altar. It has 28 panels and rings of walls. Those depictions were very typical in that area. And then also in the middle, an interesting story, that was a door, if you can see that. And that was right near the altar, and it protected the sacristy of the church, which is all the church treasures. It had 19 locks. It was so impressive at the time that it won the prize at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris for engineering. Now, if you ask me, that was some medieval security. I think we need that today on our computers. Anyway, so in the bottom corner, continuing with that other story, legend has it that few couples who wanted a divorce were held in the prison tower, the one I showed you, with one bed, one set of cutlery, for a period of 2 weeks in an effort to reconcile. And all I want to say is that in a period of 400 years, there was only one recorded divorce. So talk about medieval mediation. I don't know, maybe they knew something back then, not sure. All I know is if I had to spend 2 weeks with one spoon, I would use it on him. So this is just another look at the city before we go. As you can see, they were known for their really vividly painted houses and their lush green meadows. And to this day, if you go to this town, there's a big board in town that tells you the right way and the wrong way to renovate your house. I mean, I didn't put the picture up. It's like wrong, right. Carol, you'd like that, right? And that's another view on the right side of the fortified church in the village. And then literally as we were walking around town, these guys just came down the street. I mean, that's what you still see in this day and age. Farmers, they don't have cars. It's very expensive to buy cars and have gas. So they go around in their horse and buggy and they bring their kids along. Okay, how we doing? Good? All right, Bran Castle. So it's easy to see why Bram Stoker liked this castle and liked to use it for his character Count Dracula, because it was up in the hills and it really does look like a creepy castle. But I'm sad to report that Count Dracula nor Vlad Tepes ever lived here. But I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to give a little history of Vlad. This particular castle was built by the Knights of the Teutonic Order in 1212, so it's pretty old. And it it was overtaken by the Saxons. You know, those Saxons, since nobody could get divorced, they had to go out and take over villages. But they did use this castle to protect Brasov. So if you remember at the beginning of my presentation, I had that nice gate. That was the city of Brasov, which is on the border of Bulgaria and Romania, and it was a huge trade center. So you had actually a lot of Ottomans coming up from Turkey and trading their carpets and their wares. You had a lot of guilds positioned in Brasov, so it was important to protect this little city. And so that's why Bran Castle was originally built, and it was also to protect against invading Turks. Because remember I told you the Ottomans, they were always trying to take over territories. So let's talk a little bit about the legend of Vlad Tepes, also known as the Impaler. He was a Wallachian warrior, and you all know where Wallachia is. And he basically was not a nice person. So he perfected the art of impaling, which he learned from the Turks. A lot of people don't know that he was actually kidnapped as a young boy, and up until about age 12, he was raised by the Ottomans. So he was trained in the art of impaling by the best. So there's actually a good way to impale someone, which means a quick death, and then there's a bad way of doing it. And all I can say is that Vlad was the master of the bad way. He impaled up to 20,000 people in his 6-year reign. However, this is very odd. There were a few Romanian people that we spoke to today, and they think he is the rock star of Romania. They idolize him. They're like, he was great. I mean, he got rid of the rapist. He got rid of the murderers. There was no crime. We think he's really good. He enforced it. There's no police force at the time, so he was the enforcer. And he would actually invite people to his house for dinner, and they think they were getting something over him. Have a nice meal. And at the end of the meal, he would impale them. And he would put them out on the lawn for 2 to 3 days for all to see. So over there, I tried to put a kind picture because it really could get bad. But anyway, in the end, which I think is ironic, he was beheaded and then they impaled his body. So the moral of the story is, I guess he just lost his head. Sorry. So all the hype about Bran Castle, a lot of it is all Hollywood. They say that Vlad maybe spent a night or two there after he was captured. They were taking him back to Turkey, so the Turks held him there for a night or two and then transferred him to another location. It was the inspiration for Dracula, but they don't even think Bram Stoker ever even visited the castle. They think that he may have heard about the castle from a friend that went there. A friend drew a picture of the castle, and he really liked it, so he decided to base his story of Dracula based on the castle. So I'm sorry if I shattered anyone's dreams about that. But so going into the castle was nice. It was really touristy. Of all the castles that I visited, I have to say this was the busiest and waited on lines. But what was really interesting is they had all these sort of intriguing rooms. So there are 60 rooms connected by a network of underground passages that were used during escapes or sieges. So as you can see, this is just an example of one of the passages that you have to climb up. So if you're claustrophobic, it's probably not a good place to visit. The inner courtyard over on the right, in the middle, is a well that is almost 200 feet deep. And this was also an escape. I mean, can you imagine going down 200 feet into a well if your castle was under siege? But it led into a park which led out to a big valley, which is very far away from the castle. So I guess if you managed to get down the well, you could escape without being seen from the castle. It was converted to an elevator in 1921 when the current owner, who is Queen Marie, she's actually a granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth, they bought the place and they renovated the entire place. So the furnishings inside are not very Dracula-like. They're more modern. And they did try to sell the castle a number of years ago, but it got no bids. So they're just going to keep it in the family. So what about the Bran Castle of today? So while we were there, we actually were able to climb up to the 4 levels. You can go all the way to the top of that tower. So some of the pictures I took from up there. But I think the highlight of our visit was that we got to the top and there was a Romanian young man who was on his hands and knees proposing to his girlfriend. You can't see, but there's a ring, and she's crying. It was so romantic. She cried, everyone clapped, and I just want to say I hope that he doesn't impale her one day. Okay, moving on. So these next two are kind of remote fortresses. You probably will never hear about them, but I was able to visit them, and I thought that they were really special in their own way. But again, in the 13th century, Teutonic Knights built them to protect against invasions, and they served as a refuge for people. And what's interesting is that they all had a storage for water. So they remembered that, hey, if you're under attack, they could cut off our water supply or even poison our water supply. So they managed to have underground wells in the castle. This one had your typical church, jail, and torture chamber. And it was really cool because not a lot of people there, and they still have the original walls. So this, sadly, is not one that they've done a lot of renovation on. You'll see another one that they've started to do more renovation. But they did try, and it took them 17 years. I think it was during the communist rule. I guess it just didn't get top dog. But the next one, Rupea, was really cool because we approached it, and it was like one of these foggy mornings where it was raining, and you could barely see it. You sort of drive up, and as the clouds clear, you see this, 14th century fortress. And again, the little old lady's like in her wooden box and says, "Oh, just leave the money over there and go in." I'm like, okay. And you had your steps, of course. I don't think that was the day I did my 100 flight record, but it might have been close. But it does sit well above the town, and it protected the town. And this was a complete ruin until 2013, when actually Romania became part of the common market, and it was UE funds that supported this. So it was only opened a couple months when we arrived. So that was exciting. All right. So are we ready to go to Bulgaria? All right. Okay. Veliko Tarnovo is in Bulgaria. And I chose this city because it has a lot of history. Like, there are a lot of places in Bulgaria, but I wanted to really highlight this really nice, picturesque city in central Bulgaria. And it has narrow little houses on sheer cliffs, and it meanders the Yantra River. And it also has fortress ruins, which I'm going to talk about next. But for 300 years, Veliko Tarnovo was actually the capital of Bulgaria, and it's actually considered the third Rome, after Rome and Constantinople. It was a very cultured, developed, and relaxed city, and they had a very nice period. However, then the Ottomans came in, and they were under Ottoman rule for 500 years. And the people refer to this time period as their dark period, because they were forced to convert to Muslim. They were separated from Western Europe, and their country's language and culture was diminished. So even though they tried to maintain their identity at home by teaching their children Slav, they really couldn't do it in public. And then another disturbing thing was that any young boys that were born, Bulgarian boys between the ages of 7 and 14, were actually plucked out of the house and trained for battle, and they were also forced converted to Muslims. So that had to be hard on the family. And believe it or not, they did not gain their independence from the Ottomans until the Russian-Turkish War of 1877-1878. So it's kind of ironic that it was Russia that helped them gain their independence. And during that time period, they had peace, they increased their education. It was a renaissance for Veliko Tarnovo. However, they did do some ethnic cleansing of the Turks. I guess that was in retaliation, so it wasn't all perfect. But they were able to sort of gain back their culture and educate in the way that they wanted to. And I think Catholicism came in and became a lot more popular during that time period. There was an earthquake in 1914 that did a lot of destruction. They get a lot of earthquakes in that part of the world. So during the Ottoman rule, they had the Ottomans said that you could build churches, so they allowed some churches in this town, but the churches had to be built half in the ground so that the mosques or other religious buildings would have more prominence, which is really interesting. So while we were there, we went on a walking tour, and we saw this old church, and it was like half underground, and we're like, why is that church half underground? Was that the earthquake? And they said, no, that was the Ottoman rule. So after the earthquake of 1914, they were actually able to rebuild some churches at ground level. So that excited them. So one of my favorite places is the Tsarevets Fortress. And this is one of Bulgaria's beloved monuments. And this fortress actually dates back to the 12th century and still has some remnants from that time period, although most of it's been repaired. It served as the royal house of the patriarchs, and the patriarchs were the people that ruled Bulgaria. It had at its height 400 houses, 22 churches, a royal palace, an execution rock, which I'll talk about later. And there were some 4,000 people that lived within these walls. Of course, after their little turbulent history with the Slavs and the Bulgars for control, the Ottomans did invade this fortress in 1393, and they besieged the fortress for 3 days. And they were eventually successful in burning the fortress to the ground, which is a shame. However, laid in ruins until 1930. And then at that point, a restoration effort began, and it was finished under the Russians, so it's hard to believe we have to thank the communists for this. But it was restored in 1981 for its 1300th anniversary. So I'm going to show you some parts of it. So they actually have a church on the premises. That was the Bulgarian Patriarch Church. That church is actually from 1186, so it's one of the oldest features. And on the right side, you see the original walls. I'm actually standing in the Baldwin Tower, which is one of the towers in the fortress, and you'll see in the next slide I'll start talking about some of the towers, but to stand up there and look at the view was great. So that's on the right side. Okay, next slide. I'm getting there too. All right, so the fortress walls, as you can see all around here, believe it or not, they're 48 feet high and 30 feet thick. So forget about internet access. So the only thing that is saved from the original 11th century, 12th century is a monastery, which you can't actually see there, and a couple of churches. But I want to talk a little bit about the execution rock over there. If there were any traitors, they were made to walk out on the rock, and they were pushed into the Yantra River. Wasn't as bad as impaling, but it was a close second. So the rock's still there. Okay, the next slide is just an example of one of the gates. This is a 3-story gate that we're able to climb, and that used to designate the Asanova Gate. So it was the start of the Asanova Quarter, which was a quarter that had artisans and clerks. So it was sort of like the Greenwich Village of Tsarevets Fortress. Unfortunately, the earthquake damaged the area, so most of the artisans left that area, but the gate still stood, so it's there. And then on the right side, this is actually the entrance. I'm actually leaving, but that would be the main entrance to come in, and that folds out into the town of Veliko Tarnovo, and they have a Greek Orthodox church over there. So I just thought it was a very nice view. Okay, next slide. We're moving on to this little small village right outside of Veliko Tarnovo called Arbanasi. And I chose this village because it's known for its churches and its monasteries. And when I show you this church of the Nativity, I think you'll be like, wow, because it's pretty impressive. But as I was walking along, this man was walking by and I took his picture, and apparently he wasn't happy with me. Maybe he was thinking of the impaler, I don't know. But anyway, this little town was founded in the 15th century by the Christians, and it was taken over by the Ottomans in the 1600s. I know there's a theme here. But the town ended up prospering, and it did very well, and attracted a lot of wealthy merchants who settled in the town because it was an international trade route between Transylvania, Wallachia, and Brasov. So a lot of culture came to the town, a lot of prosperity. It had a very diverse population, 5 churches and 2 monasteries. The Ottomans were here as well, but they allowed people to observe other religions, and so they were very supportive of churches staying intact. And that's one of the reasons why this church on the left, the Church of the Nativity, dates back to the 1500s. And it was originally 3 churches that they all put together. And so I'm going to share with you what it looks like on the inside. Next slide. So it is actually overwhelming, and there's like 3 separate rooms like this. So you walk in and you're just like, I don't even know where to look, because this is just beautiful. So this is a very similar style of Eastern Christianity. So they use something called iconostasis, which is walls of icons and religious paintings all put together. And they're usually separated by the nave and the sanctuary. So you usually walk into different areas, but when you first walk into the church, they seem to have a lot of the frescoes and the iconostasis. And then as you go into other areas of the church, you tend to see frescoes and hand-carved wood paintings. In this church alone, which was a small church as you saw from the outside, 3,500 figures and 2,000 scenes of wood iconostasis. So if you turn to the next page, you'll see some samplings. On the left here, this is sort of a close-up of the frescoes that were painted on the wall. That is a scene of the Nativity and Judgment Day. In the middle, you see what the wood iconostasis look like, the hand carvings. I mean, they actually start with wood and they hand carve all that, and then they paint on top of it. And on the right is a kaleidoscope fresco. I mean, and it just takes up like the whole mass of the ceiling. So it's like you see one thing and you're like, wow, and then you look over there, wait, wow. And pictures really don't do justice to this place, so you have to go see it for yourself. But down in the corner on the right side, I thought that was a really interesting thing, because it's a 17th century inscription in Greek, and it was on the wall, and it's from the time of when the Ottomans did not want to recognize the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. They wanted them to fold up into the Greek Orthodox Church. So they actually banned the Bulgarian Orthodox Church from having services on their own, and that was a proclamation saying that they were officially going to be served under the Greek Orthodox Church. So that was interesting. So even though they were very open, they still wanted consolidation. It's kind of like a corporation, I guess. It says, I just had to put this picture in because I love this picture. I just love the feeling and the mood, because this is what it was like to walk around this village. And, you know, it was like a hazy Sunday morning with the mist coming off the rocks, and just your miscellaneous crosses on the side of the church. I thought it was nice. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a monastery. And I picked Bachkovo Monastery because it is the oldest and the second largest Bulgarian monastery, and I thought it would be a really good sample to use, because you can just go on forever. There's a lot of them. But this was situated in the western part of the Rhodope Mountains, so it's in southern Bulgaria, and it's south of Veliko Tarnovo on the way to Turkey. It's known for its unique combination of Byzantine, Georgian, and Bulgarian culture, and it was built in the 11th century. As I walked into this monastery, of course, it's raining and fogging, and it's just downpourings, and you can't tell from the picture, but it is drenches. But as you walk in, you can see the style, the 2-story bone vault of the monastery, and in the back where the cross is, that actually is the oldest part of the monastery. And so it was built over a couple hundred years, and they added parts to it. But that's one of the only things that survived from the original. And you're going to see shortly why it's so popular. So if you go to the next page, again, on the right side in the corner, that is the only thing left of the original monastery, right there. It's the medieval ossuary. And then on the left side, this is what it looks like when you typically walk into these churches. This is the Church of the Virgin Mary, and it was built in 1604. It's got 17th century iconostasis, which we just learned about, and 19th century murals on the ceilings and walls. So I guess you can't really see the ceilings and walls because I'm really showing you the altar now that has a lot of those wood paintings. And then while we were there happened to be a family blessing going on. I think it was a baptism. And so I snuck a picture of the priest. He didn't see me, otherwise I'd still be there. It was nice, though. It was really nice to see a ceremony. It was very solemn. And, of course, with the rain outside, it was like, I could never live here. Anyway, what was really cool about this monastery is that it had these inner courtyards. And in the inner courtyards, they had frescoes up and down the walls. And on the upper left-hand corner, you can see there's a famous painter. His name is Zagraf, and he did a lot of frescoes in the 1840s. And this one's all about Judgment Day. But what I think is interesting about this is that in his paintings, he's got the devil in there. And there's, up here, a lot of people don't notice that. And he's painted them in there, and I'm going to show you in the next slide, not yet though, their depiction of the Judgment Day, which is interesting. This is a picture from inside the church of a fresco. And on the right side is a picture of the painted on the wood. During the 1930s, they discovered a secret chamber in the monastery where they uncovered 103 manuscripts and 252 books, which were the very first printings of the books. So they went back to the 1500s. So it was right after they started printing books. And that's how they discovered all the history of the monastery, because most of the history was destroyed by the Ottomans, but they uncovered this secret chamber that had all these books. And another interesting factoid is that in 1943, 2 Bulgarian monks actually hid Jews in the monastery so that they wouldn't be exported to the death camps during the Nazi occupation. So I didn't get that far in my research, but I'm wondering if those two events are related. Like while they were hiding the Jews, they found all these manuscripts and books, but I guess that's to be continued. So if you take a look at the next slide, I love this slide. So it's pouring outside, and you walk into these beautiful courtyards, and no one's here, by the way. And you just see these gorgeous frescoes on the wall, and then you see this cute little hen come in and dry off his wings. I had to take the picture. Anyway, something else that was really cool. Up in the right-hand corner, I was telling you about Judgment Day and their depiction. So that black guy up there, he's actually in the process of killing an Ottoman. So that was their interpretation of Judgment Day. And then down in the right corner is what's called a panoramic mural, and it runs along the whole outside wall of the rectory. I mean, I originally had a panoramic picture of it, but Rob's like, it doesn't look so good. This thing was just huge. It had to be like 150 feet long, and it was actually an interpretation of the buildings at the time. It was created in 1846, and it has sustained really harsh weather conditions, so rain, snow, sleet, sun, and still those are the original bright colors. They've done nothing on the restoration of it, so I don't know what process they used, but it's pretty impressive. And it shows you what the monastery looked like in the 1840s. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit of the fun part of the trip. So in terms of transportation, I actually went by plane, by train, by bus, by trolley, by taxi, by foot, and by boat. And I also talked about the Wizz Airlines. So these are just sort of a collage of the different modes of transportation that I took. On the left side here, that was like a cable car that takes you up to the Buda Hills. And over on, you can see the Danube River. And you can see that's where the infamous Parliament building is, but I guess it's more over to the left. So if you go to Budapest and you want to see some great views, I highly recommend, as opposed to walking up to the castle, you can actually take the cable car. So we walk down. And then on the right side, that's me landing my Wizz Airlines at the Pennsylvania airport. Of course, they have no security, so you just walk off the plane. And you walk into the terminal. No, go back. So God knows who could be going in there. And by the way, no passport control. So I can tell you that I landed in Budapest. No one checked my passport. I flew to Transylvania. No one checked my passport. And they were worried about the Syrian migration. I don't know. I got in and out of there without being viewed. And then down here was we took the bus into Turkey. No, I didn't walk into Turkey. We took the bus in, and there was a whole bunch of lorries, trucks just piled up for like 10 miles. I think they were going to be there for a day to get into Turkey. Okay, so next, people along the way. So part of the fun was really meeting new people and sort of getting into their head and asking them their opinions and what was life like in the country that they lived in. So on the upper right-hand side, that's That's Adrian, our taxi driver that we hired to take us through. Adrian. His name was Adrian. Up on the right-hand corner. So he grew up in communist Romania. He was actually only in his early 40s, so this is interesting. And he was telling us how the Russians came in, and basically Romania is an agricultural country. They're very self-sufficient. They had a lot of farming products. They could feed their people. But when the Russians came in, they literally took all the agricultural products out of the country to buy arms, and they rationed all the people. So he said he was a family of 4. He had a brother, and he was like 14. His brother was 10, and they actually got 1 liter of milk and 1 pound of red meat a week. And he said it was really sad because they produced their own, they were self-sufficient, but the Russians came in and took it. So he was actually a little bitter about that, but now he was, living the dream because he was taking Americans in his taxi and surely taking us for a ride in more ways than one. Then in the upper left-hand corner was Plami from Veliko Tarnovo, and she actually relied on tourists. She made jewelry in her home, and she had 2 little boys who we met, and so she made jewelry to, make a living. And then I guess her husband was watching the boys that day, so she was a little nervous. But she said they see a lot of German tourists, but hardly ever see Americans. So she was very excited to talk to us and ask us where we were from and what life was like outside of Bulgaria. And then in the left-hand bottom corner, that's Tavi from Plovdiv. She was our tour guide. They did free walking tours. She was adorable. She was a professional opera singer who gave history tours for extra cash and also to do things during the day because she mostly sang at night and she traveled. She was very confident, gentle, and kind, and she gave us a very nice insight into the youth of Bulgaria. She took us to a university restaurant and, drinking songs. It was a lot of fun. She actually gave us a sample of her opera skills that I did record on my iPhone, but Robert said I couldn't play it today because 1, we didn't have the time, and 2, he said that the vocals might not be so good, so I'll spare you of that. But I thought she was pretty good. And then in the right, my favorite, this is Vladimir Botsadavov-Grev. He's my Bulgarian monk in training. Okay, believe it or not, he approached us when we were in the Bachkovo Monastery in that church, and he asked us if we could do him a favor. We're like, okay. He goes, could you send me postcards from the U.S.? I'm thinking, postcards? Who has postcards? We're like, sure. So he gave us his address, but he was very interested in our literature. He wanted to read our tour book. He'd only been at the monastery 3 months, and he had a 14-year-old daughter, but I guess this was his career change. And he was not sure if he was going to stick it out or not. But he saw news from the outside world, so he grabbed our tour book, and he's reading the book. And I really think that was probably the first time he'd read a book in months. But he was very sweet, and I've sent him about 4 postcards so far from different parts of the United States. I don't know if he's getting them because he hasn't written me back. Maybe he decided the monk life wasn't for him. Anyway, local cuisine. So this was fun. Okay, so I loved trying all these exotic foods. So we sampled things from wild boar Hungarian sausage. You really should try that, Carol. It's great. To lamb pastrami and polenta. Cured meats and cheeses were really popular in the Hungarian Transylvanian area. And then as we traveled south towards Turkey, the cuisine influence was more Middle Eastern, which was also awesome. They make really good coffee. So over there in the corner on the right side, it says some mornings you need a cafe mocha vodka Valium latte. Keep calm and carry on. It's Monday. I was up in the corner there. And then in the middle, that was my first Turkish coffee. So if you want hair on your chest, I recommend that. But they serve it really sweet with Turkish delight. Those are those candies behind you. And it's an experience. It's great. You have to, I like the coffee, actually. But one of my favorite things was the Bulgarian and Romanian red wines. Excellent, excellent wines. You don't get a lot of exports of them. They don't add sulfates, so it really, really is great wine. They have excellent climate and temperature for that. And even the apple cider was good. I guess all the Saxon influence. So You can definitely get a varied cuisine there, and it was a lot of fun. And then if you just walk, you're 10 miles a day, you don't have to worry about the cured meats. All right, so here's the fun part. Mystery site number 1. Okay. Any guesses on what this is? No, close. It's in Istanbul. Yeah, you said you weren't going to say anything. Okay, Sam's cheating. It's the Blue Mosque. All right. It's also known as the Sultanahmet Cami, and it dominates the skyline. So as you can see, I had to bring the Westfield leader and embarrass my friend down there in front of the Blue Mosque. It's actually one of the most celebrated mosques in the world, and it's known because of the Iznik blue tiles, which you see there that cover the interior. Absolutely beautiful. There are 20,143 tiles of 70 different styles. But they're so high up in the ceiling that they're really too far away to examine in detail. They were put up there a long time ago. They were produced actually in the 1500s. And this particular mosque was a pet project of the Sultan first. He was totally into building this. And so not only did he stand alongside the laborers and help lay the bricks, but he summons all the Iznik tile makers throughout the land. You will do my project ahead of all other orders. And no one else is allowed to put any orders in until I finish with my 20,000 tiles. The structure has 6 minarets, and it's supposed to basically rival the 6 minarets in Mecca. But then there's sort of a misunderstanding because they say that he wanted domes of gold, but I guess the word gold is really close to 6, the number 6. So there was a misinterpretation with the architect. You have to be careful about that. So instead of putting gold domes up, the architect put 6 domes up. All right, so. And then another thing that he did was to undermine the supremacy of Islam over Christian Byzantine, because Constantinople had both. The Blue Mosque was strategically built right opposite the Royal Palace and Hagia Sophia. So that was a bit of a sore point. If you are a practicing Muslim, you can enter through the front door. I did not pass the test, so I was forced to go in the back door, but I took off my shoes and I put in a head covering, and I was able to view the beauty from the back. However, when I was in Edirne, I could sneak through the front door. They weren't checking as much. Okay, mystery site number 2. This is a hard one. It's also in Turkey. Yeah, I know. It's stumped. Okay, this is the Great Synagogue in Edirne, Turkey. It was actually built in 1907. It was the 3rd largest in the world at the time. A large fire in 1905 destroyed most of Edirne, the city, and there were 13 separate synagogues at that point, so they merged them all together into one. And the French architect, his name is Francis Dupré, he modeled this synagogue after the Ottoman Sephardic synagogue in Vienna, which was later destroyed by the Nazis. So this is actually the only one left of its kind. It was abandoned in 1983 due to lack of worshipers. There were no more Jews left in Edirne. Apparently there's only one there now. And then it was further damaged when the roof collapsed in 1997, left only really the sides and the facade. So they were able to collect funds to restore this place, which is amazing. And they had all the history for some reason, and they were able to put it back together. And in an effort, the Turkish people did it in an effort to support religious freedom and social life, religious groups in Turkey. So very, very open society. I know people find that hard to believe, but they really are. They have all religions. But I will tell you, this is in a neighborhood that has kind of run down, and we walked right by it. We didn't even see it. They were like, oh, and then we walked in, it was completely empty except people cleaning the place. So I don't think it gets a lot of use. It was opened in only March of 2015, so we were there just 6 months after the inauguration. So that was fun. So, in conclusion, that's all that I have to speak today. I did pretty good on time, and hopefully I'll see you on my next adventure. Are there any questions? Sam?